Frankenstein's Aunt by Rune Pettersson. The Prince Awakens. It was a damp night with low clouds racing across the sky. The thunder rumbled, but it was still in the distance. Lightning lit up the whole sky with a flashing, breathless blue light. The claps of thunder apparently came from on high, and then in long, cracking, tumbling waves descended into a rumbling, mumbling rolling on the horizon. The rain poured down, rustling and rattling in the undergrowth around the castle. A sharp bluish-white light shone out of the narrow windows in the laboratory tower. A wet raven had sought shelter from the rain in one of the topmost windows, and was tramping up and down on his ice-cold feet, fluffing out his feathers and peering in through the window. Far away, down there in the stone well, he could see one black and two white figures moving around, a fourth figure lying on some kind of bunk. The fourth figure looked like one of those two-legged creatures carried home from battle. The raven was very old and had flown over many a battlefield in his day. Nowadays, he could no longer be bothered with two-legged creatures and their strange activities. He turned his back on them, hunched up, and fell into a raven-black slumber. Inside the laboratory, Hannah Frankenstein looked up at the hatch in the roof. The rain was rattling against the metal plates, and another flash of lightning flickered through the windows. She thought she saw a large bird perched in one of them. "What terrible weather," she said, an unlit cigar in the corner of her mouth. "Just as it should be," said Igor. "Just as it should be." "It's coming closer," said Franz, sitting with a pair of earphones on, staring at the flickering needle of a gauge. "It'll soon be time to send up the kites," said Igor delightedly. Igor and Franz were wearing white coats tied at the back, Igor's idea, because, as he said, that was as it should be. He had tried to get a white coat onto Aunt Frankenstein, too, but she had refused to have anything to do with such nonsense. She thought her sturdy black traveling costume was perfectly adequate for the matter at hand. The monster, or the prince, as Franz had insisted on calling him, was lying on his back on a high bunk that resembled an operating table. His arms were at his sides, his body bandaged from head to foot. Hannah Frankenstein did not know what the bandages were for, but presumed things would be different when the boy was remade, as she called it, and Igor insisted that everything was as it should be. She made no objections. It was not worth arguing about. Perhaps the monster kept himself warmer that way during the warming-up process. She lit her cigar and looked around the laboratory walls. Franz and Igor had done all the necessary repairs there in 3 days. She herself had spent the time trying to tidy up 2 fairly undamaged bedrooms in the castle, as well as Henry's library, by having a roaring fire in the tiled stoves. She had actually made the bedrooms habitable, and there was hope for the library. At least she could have her glass of sherry there in the evenings. Soon, she would have some help with the repairs to the rest of the castle. She looked expectantly at the bandaged giant and felt like a little girl at Christmas, impatiently waiting for the hours to go by before she could open her parcels. "Well, boys," she said, "what are we waiting for?" "We're waiting for the thunder to come directly overhead," he said. "It'll be here any moment now." Technically and scientific as he was, Franz had soon familiarized himself with the whole procedure described by Henry. Aunt Frankenstein was extremely grateful because, when it came to electricity, she herself was quite ignorant and didn't entirely trust Igor. Franz leaned over the monster, rather like a nearsighted surgeon bending over his patient. A short metal rod protruded from the bandages on each side of the monster's neck. And to these rods Franz coupled cables hanging down from the roof. As he fastened the cable ends down, Aunt Frankenstein said, "So the current will go through those hinges in his neck, will it? I understand that much." "They're not hinges," said Igor haughtily. "That's the cathode, and that's the anode," he went on, producing both words in grandiose scientific terms. "Like the poles in a battery," said Franz, without a glimmer of superiority. That quality in him Aunt Frankenstein appreciated most of all. Franz pointed. "Plus on this side of the neck and minus on that side." At that moment, a blinding flash of lightning whistled through the laboratory, and the clap of thunder followed almost immediately, shaking and rattling the hatches as if by a violent whirlwind. The time's come, shouted Igor. Open the hatches. Franz reached out toward the switch. The hum of an engine could be heard somewhere, then a piercing screech as the rusty hatches of the roof slid apart. Down came the rain in gusts, extinguishing Aunt Frankenstein's cigar as she stood there with her face turned upward. Ragged clouds were racing past the open hatch, and another flash of lightning turned them as white as torn sails. The laboratory was filled with the raging thunderstorm, howling wildly like a ghostly organ through the spiral glass tubes and shiny steel rods. Their hair was tossed wildly in the wind. Aunt Frankenstein's iron-gray locks, Igor's yellowish tufts, and Franz's reddish-fair fluff, which suddenly turned into a dramatic shock of hair. "Switch on!" shouted Igor. Hannah Frankenstein suddenly felt she must take part in the performance. She wanted to play a major part, and it was no use just standing in the wings any longer. Let me, she cried, leaping forward. Franz was already prepared to pull down the huge switch, but he immediately relinquished the role. Aunt Frankenstein grasped the worn wooden handle, closed her eyes, and pulled. Long, crackling, snaky strips of light began to curl up the tall glass tubes around the walls. Then the whole apparatus started vibrating and glowing red, orange, and blue. "Up with the kites!" yelled Igor, who wished to be the producer of the play. "Up with the table! Press that button there!" Franz glanced at him rather irritably. He had read it all up carefully, and knew what to do, and Igor knew that he knew too. They loosened a row of moorings, and from the laboratory floor, 4 box-shaped sailcloth kites rose into the wind. These kites had been specially made by Henry Frankenstein and his colleague, Dr. Pretorius, to trap the hitherto unknown kind of electricity that was released in violent thunderstorms and contained the life-giving sparks that reversed all known theories on electricity. The kites rose up into the racing clouds, their ropes shining with a green phosphorescent light. Down on the floor, the needles on the control panel were rocking violently. The time had come to elevate the table with the monster on it. Franz turned on another switch, and, with a piercing, clattering screech, the table rose into the sky on its 4 chains. Up through the stone well of the laboratory slid the monster, through an inferno of flashing arcs of vibrating orange and bluish-white light. Aunt Frankenstein had been standing at the end of the table, and she watched the soles of the great boots ascending higher and higher, illuminated by the flickering light. "Good luck, Frankie boy," she cried, "and come down human. God and all the fuses willing." In the middle of the excitement, she noticed that one of the boots needed soling. Franz was following the ascent of the monster on the control panel. The needles swung violently back and forth, plunging far too often into the red area marked danger. "The tension's terrific," he cried. "Yes, it certainly is," yelled Aunt Frankenstein in reply. "I'm beginning to understand Henry." "I don't mean that sort of tension," shouted Franz. "Electric tension, the voltage." "Danger!" screamed all his instruments. Cold sweat broke out on his forehead, his glasses falling right down to the tip of his nose and his hair standing on end. The thunderstorm had now reached a climax, lightning continually flashing above the roof. The monster stretched out on his bunk on a level with the hatch up there, fully exposed to the mysterious life-giving forces. The thunder growled and roared, and the floor shook, the whole laboratory apparently filling with electricity and the smell of phosphorus and burning bakelite. Suddenly, the meter needles leaped into the red and fell back all at the same time. Franz crouched down. With a tremendous crack, an overloaded part of the apparatus exploded above his head. Splinters of glass rained down all over the floor, and the laboratory filled with thick, choking smoke. "Let the table down again," screamed Igor in falsetto. "Let it down! Let it down!" "Let it down yourself," coughed Franz. "I can't see my head in front of my nose." "I hope that was the right button," said Hannah Frankenstein. She had already pressed a button she had found in the smoke, a button she thought had "down" on it. A great silence descended after the explosion. The thunder seemed to retreat, and the storm abated. Gentle rain was falling onto the stone floor, slowly dispelling the smoke, and there, in the yellowish mist, they saw the table come wafting down from above, like a bucket in a well of muddy water seen from the viewpoint of a frog, the chains creaking quietly. With a tinkling thump, the table landed on the broken glass. Steam was coming out of the monster, as from a freshly baked loaf. Hannah Frankenstein, again, noticed the smell of smoked lamb, sharper now and mixed with a peculiar electric smell. Igor came hobbling through the broken glass, which crunched under his feet. "Take the bandages off," he squeaked. Hannah Frankenstein had already started opening her parcel. The moment had come at last. As she unwound the bandages, she remembered, almost word for word, the lines in Henry's notes. "How can I describe my feelings?" As the bandages fell away and he finally opened his eyes. "I tried to give him a high intellectual forehead. The forehead was high enough, all right, but far too high, and his hair was hanging down in black straggles from his flat skull, but he was breathing. He was alive." "Good morning, your highness," said Franz. The monster's watery eyes flickered, his eyelashes trembling. The puckered, still steaming skin of his face twitched, and his thick black lips stretched as he opened his mouth in a grimace. A dry whimper came out of his still bandaged chest, his lungs making a sound like the first breeze of spring rustling in last year's dead leaves. And that's the end of that chapter.